Number 18, Christina Harrison. A 26-year-old mother of one named Alexandria Kress Boris was loading groceries into her car on Valentine's Day in 2023 outside a busy Kroger store in Irmo, South Carolina, when she suddenly got into a heated argument with another woman. It all started over a simple disagreement about who had the right of way in the parking lot, according to the police chief overseeing the case, Bobby Dale. Sadly, the fight between Alexandria and 23-year-old Christina Harrison went from 0 to 100 and ended in a gun being pulled out. In an email to Fox News, Dale wrote that Alexandria allegedly spat at the other woman. When she turned away, she was shot in the back of the head. Alexandria died from her wounds. Christina quickly fled the scene in her car, but turned herself in just an hour and a half later. She currently faces charges of murder, unlawfully carrying a pistol, and possession of a weapon during a violent crime. Witnesses, including Alexandria's husband Tyler, confirmed that the two women didn't know each other before the incident. To make the situation even more upsetting, Alexandria's death came only 6 days after her brother was killed in a tragic shooting. Number 17, Davia Chapman. In August 2022, something sent 24-year-old Davia Chapman into a blind rage while she waited for her boyfriend outside a Kroger in Cincinnati, Ohio. When Jawan Khalid Lunsford came out of the store, Chapman allegedly rammed into him with her van. She also struck an innocent pedestrian, 58-year-old Christopher Griffith. Surveillance footage from that horrifying day showed a woman who looked like Chapman getting out of the vehicle and punching Lunsford multiple times. The couple's child was actually still in the van during the crash. Griffith died from his injuries, and Lunsford was taken to the hospital with only a broken leg. According to police, Chapman went through Lunsford's phone while he was inside the store and found text messages between her boyfriend and her sister that she didn't approve of. She was indicted on charges of aggravated murder, felony assault, attempted murder, as well as child endangerment. If convicted, she could face life in prison. Number 16, Harry Patterson Jr. During the early morning one day in 2023, 41-year-old Jonathan Gant went into a deli in Queens, New York, and asked the employee behind the counter if they had a cigarette. The worker said no, and Gant allegedly became so angry that he threatened the employee. A 68-year-old man intervened to try and defuse the situation, so Gant left the store only to come back later to get into an argument with the customer, who tried to stop him. A physical fight ensued, during which the elderly man pulled a knife and stabbed Gant straight in the leg. The blade cut into an artery, causing Gant to fatally bleed out. 38-year-old Muhammad Ali, who wasn't involved in the tense situation but had worked at the deli for over a decade, told the New York Daily News that both men were regular customers that he saw often. There had never been any problems with them in the past. Ali was shocked by Gant's anger after being denied a cigarette, since it was out of character, and he struggled to wrap his mind around how the fight escalated into violence so quickly. The alleged stabber fled the scene on foot and locked himself in his apartment after the attack. He later surrendered without incident at the request of police. Authorities have not yet announced whether or not he'll face charges. Gant's friends and family were shocked by the claim that the victim lost his temper. They described Gant as a laid-back and kind person who had no aggressive tendencies. The investigation is still ongoing and will hopefully provide more of the answers his loved ones are looking for. Number 15, Arturo Cuevas and Daisy Barrera. 28-year-old Sunnyside, Queens resident Wilson Chabla Liagikota got caught up in an ongoing fight with his neighbors over a parking spot, which isn't that unusual in New York City. But the spat took a horrifying turn when Liagikota confronted 30-year-old Arturo Cuevas and 27-year-old Daisy Barrera one afternoon during March 2023. In a merciless act of violence that was all captured on camera, Cuevas and Barrera attacked Liagikota. Security footage of the encounter showed a woman repeatedly beating the victim with a bat, while a man stomped, kicked, and struck Liagikota with a weapon in his hand. A witness told police that she saw Cuevas stab the victim multiple times that day. The victim's girlfriend, Delia Chimbe, was also hit as the attack waged on. In the video, the suspects could be seen walking away while Jimbe held Liguacota's hand and called 911. According to the most recent update, the victim is still in the hospital with severe brain trauma while he continues to fight for his life. He recently underwent emergency brain surgery and is on a ventilator. Cuevas and Barrera were taken into custody at their apartment after a brief standoff with law enforcement officers. They were each charged with 1 count of attempted murder and 2 counts of assault and are now being held at Rikers without bond while they await the upcoming steps in their cases. A neighbor who asked to stay anonymous told the New York Daily News that Liguacota is a hard-working man who typically minds his own business and doesn't even know how to fight. She said that he had actually been physically attacked over a parking-related disagreement in the past, and someone had broken his nose during a previous fight. Number 14. Shannon Brandt. In 2022, during a fight over politics with a young man less than half his age, 41-year-old Shannon Brandt rammed into the victim with his truck. The disagreement broke out during the morning in the middle of the street in McHenry, North Dakota. After striking 18-year-old Kayla Ellingson, Brandt called 911 and confessed to what he'd done. He seemed very panicked during the phone call and expressed concerns that Ellingson may do something to him involving an extremist Republican group. Brandt said he overheard the young man making several phone calls and saying something similar to, "You're going to have to come here and handle him." Afraid that he was about to be attacked or worse, Brandt apparently handled the situation by getting into his car and stepping on the gas pedal. During the phone call, Brandt offered to give first aid to Ellingson, but he was told not to by the dispatcher. By the time officers got to the scene, Brandt had already returned to his home in Glenfield, North Dakota. Ellingson later died from his injuries, so Brandt was taken into custody on suspicion of being responsible for the man's death. According to police, he was heavily drunk when they showed up at his house and put him in cuffs. Shortly after the incident, authorities revealed that the only calls Ellingson seemed to make during the time frame he was killed were to his parents. Also, doctors concluded that Ellingson was on the ground at the time he was killed and that his injuries were not consistent with simply being hit by a car, but with being run over entirely. Ellingson's mom told police that her son called her twice right before his death. The first time, he told her that Brandt was asking who his parents were. A few minutes later, he called her again and asked if he should call for help from some friends. At that point, his mother decided to pick him up. On her way to get him, Ellingson called her a third time and mentioned something about someone coming after him. Then, the call suddenly dropped. Brandt was initially charged with murder, but in early 2023, the prosecutor reduced his charge down to manslaughter. No explanation has been offered as to why. Number 13. Family Dollar Fatality. A 43-year-old security guard named Calvin Munnerlin was simply doing his job by enforcing the COVID mask requirement at the Dollar General store he worked at in Flint, Michigan. He paid a terrible price for it in 2020 when he told a customer, 47-year-old Charmel Teague, that her daughter needed to wear a mask. Teague immediately launched into a rant and spat at Munnerlin, so he told her to leave the store and asked the cashier not to serve her. Her behavior continued to escalate further, so Munnerlin had to chase her out of the store and tackle her to the ground. A witness who was shopping at the time said that they remembered hearing either Charmel or her daughter yelling, "Wait until I get back." 20 minutes later, Charmel's husband, 47-year-old Larry Teague, and her son, 23-year-old Ramonier Bishop, went into the Dollar General store for revenge. Larry entered the store and demanded to talk to whoever put their hands on his wife. At the same time, Bishop approached Munnerlin from behind and shot him in the head. A couple who were shopping at the store during the attack described rushing out of the store and coming face-to-face with Larry, who allegedly warned them to run away. Larry and Bishop fled the scene and went on the run. Authorities apprehended Larry at a hotel in Texas a week later and tracked Bishop to a house in a neighboring town. The suspects were all charged with murder. Charmel's daughter was arrested on suspicion of tampering with evidence, lying to police during the investigation, and accessory after the fact. She pleaded no contest to the charges and was sentenced to time served plus a year of probation. The other 3 defendants went straight to trial. Charmel Teague's lawyer argued that her involvement in the crime was very small. Ramonier Bishop's attorney claimed that her client shot Manolin to defend his stepfather's life after seeing Manolin and another man intimidating him. She adamantly denied that the murder had anything to do with mask requirements or even the fight that happened just 20 minutes earlier between Charmel and Manolin. Needless to say, the jury wasn't convinced, and Bishop and his parents were found guilty of first-degree murder. In the end, they were sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Number 12. Johnny William Walters. During a 3-day alcohol and meth binge in 2020, 47-year-old William Walters took a sip of his friend John Jock McClellan's bottle of whiskey. This small action triggered a drunken argument between the men, who'd been close friends for 30 years, that quickly became physical. It ended with 63-year-old McClellan dead. Walters was very upset over his buddy's death, but he was charged with killing McClellan, whose body showed signs of being struck 30 to 40 times. Prosecutors accused Walters of brutally beating his friend to death, while knowing that McClellan was older, smaller, and weaker than him. In his defense, Walters said that he and McClellan had substance abuse issues and that it fueled their fight. His lawyer, Mark Norman, argued that McClellan's health issues contributed to his death and that he probably would have survived if he were in better condition. Walters was found guilty of a reduced manslaughter charge and was ordered to serve 9 years in prison. The judge acknowledged that he didn't mean to kill McClellan, but said that he should have realized how serious his actions were, especially since the victim was in poor health and used a walking cane. She also pointed toward Walters' lengthy history of violence with 8 prior assault convictions, which suggest a pattern of lacking control over his emotions. Number 11. Mark Storms. In 2017, during a Sunday morning church service in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, 27-year-old Robert Braxton III unknowingly took a seat that was reserved for someone else. A church usher and a clergy member asked him to move at first, but Braxton quickly became agitated, so they just decided to let him stay in the seat. Others remember that Braxton was acting out of character that day. He seemed on edge, but it's unclear what exactly made him act that way. 46-year-old congregation member Mark Storms had no reason to intervene, but he decided to do so anyway. He approached Braxton, showed him his concealed weapon permit while visibly reaching for his gun, and told him to leave. Braxton then punched Storms, who responded by shooting him in the chest in front of 300 churchgoers. Storms was arrested for the shooting and argued that he acted in self-defense, which was hard to believe considering the fact that Braxton was unarmed. A jury convicted Storms of voluntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment, so he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. At his sentencing, the judge alluded to the defendant having a hero complex and a perceived need to inject himself into a dangerous situation. And in the situation with Braxton, the judge said Storms had absolutely no business getting involved at all. Storms appealed his conviction and sentence later on, but another judge upheld the rulings. Number 10. Ricky Braden. At a time when 22-year-old U.S. Army soldier Ricky Braden and his wife Kenesha Johnson should have been in the honeymoon phase of their marriage, they were instead plagued by constant arguments. They got into a particularly vicious fight one day in May 2016 when Braden got angry at Johnson for a photo she posted on social media. There was nothing inappropriate about the picture, but Braden thought his wife was trying to get attention from other men by posting it. He later apologized, so Kenesha thought everything between them was fine until he showed up at her job in a rage. He was supposed to be on base at Fort Hood that morning, so Johnson was surprised to see him pull into the parking lot at the Walgreens she worked at. She went outside and they argued in the middle of the parking lot, where Kenesha tried convincing her husband that she wasn't doing anything behind his back and that his attention was enough for her. But Braden wasn't listening to reason, and Kenesha eventually gave up trying to have a rational conversation. As she turned to go back into the building, Braden shot at her twice, missing her once and hitting her in the leg. She then ran inside and locked the doors. 35-year-old former Marine T.J. Antel witnessed the incident and tried to perform a citizen's arrest on Braden, who refused to follow his orders and shot him in the head. Antel was pronounced dead at the scene, and Braden turned himself into law enforcement not long after. Just 6 weeks into Braden and Johnson's marriage, a man was dead, another man's life was ruined, and a woman narrowly avoided death simply for posting a photo online. Thankfully, Braden will likely never see freedom again. He was consequently convicted of murder and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and was sentenced to life in prison. Number 9. Benjamin Middendorf. 25-year-old Benjamin Middendorf called 911 one night in 2016 and told the dispatcher that he shot his brother, 28-year-old Nicholas Middendorf. In the background, a woman later identified as the brother's mom could be heard saying, "I'm going to kill my son, and I hope you go to jail." Police got to the family's St. Cloud, Florida home to find Nicholas dead from a gunshot wound to the chest and Benjamin soaked in blood. They immediately took Benjamin into custody on suspicion of murder. Investigators learned that the argument started after Nicholas and their mom got home from a night out drinking for Cinco de Mayo. Benjamin said he didn't drink that day and accused the victim of bullying him. In a statement, St. Cloud Police Department spokesperson Denise Roberts said that the argument that sparked the shooting was over a cheeseburger. Not surprisingly, authorities didn't see this as a justified reason to shoot someone and charged him with first-degree premeditated murder. The case fell off the airwaves after it made headlines after Benjamin's arrest. Florida prison records show that he served a 3-year sentence for a manslaughter charge and has since been released. Number 8. Ezekiel Hicks. When 41-year-old Craig Brewer got the sudden urge to pay it forward at a Waffle House in Gainesville, Florida at 2:30 in the morning back in 2019, he probably didn't expect it to end in violence. The Good Samaritan started randomly handing out $20 bills to fellow customers and covering their meals, and a young woman allegedly got jealous that she wasn't included in his generosity. A man that the disgruntled diner was with, who was later identified as 25-year-old Ezekiel Hicks, confronted Brewer with his friend's complaints. An argument ensued and Hicks went out to the parking lot shortly before coming back with a gun. A customer tried to talk him out of going inside, but he didn't listen. Hicks then shot Brewer in the middle of the crowded restaurant and fled the scene. Police were already on their way to the restaurant since an employee had called them before the shooting and asked for help clearing people out. Officers got there and found the victim dead from multiple gunshot wounds, including at least one to the head. The entire incident was captured on surveillance footage from start to finish. Authorities initially charged Hicks with first-degree murder, but he took a plea deal for a reduced manslaughter charge and one gun-related charge. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Number 7. Caitlin O'Donovan and Sarah Franks. In 2023, at 3 in the morning one day, a Florida man was standing on the balcony of his Clearwater home when two women appeared. 29-year-old Sarah Franks and 29-year-old Caitlin O'Donovan argued with the man and then chucked a bucket full of glitter towards him. Franks then climbed over the balcony and into the house, armed with even more glitter, and led O'Donovan into the home by opening the front door. The women allegedly covered the home with sparkles and then left, with Frank stopping to kick in a window on her way out. Police were notified of the incident and tracked the women down. They noticed that Frank's car was warm to the touch and even saw glitter inside. Authorities charged Franks and O'Donovan with felony burglary, and Franks caught a criminal mischief charge for kicking the victim's window. The suspects bonded out for $75,000, and the charges were eventually dropped. Franks told the Smoking Gun that she and O'Donovan were married and that they had both had a casual relationship with the glitter bomb victim. Their three-way fling was no longer happening when the glitter incident took place, but Franks didn't go into further detail about the situation or what inspired the glitter assault. Number 6. Louise Martin Pages. In 2020, 911 dispatchers in Miami, Florida got a troubling call from a young man who said that he snapped and shot his mother. Officers responded to the Miami Beach home of 29-year-old Louise Martin Pages, who surrendered to their custody. In the house, they found 59-year-old Miriam Gonzalez dead. According to police documents, the shooting came after a series of petty arguments between the mother and son. Pages reportedly asked his mom if he could borrow her car to look for jobs, but she said no since it was Labor Day and she didn't think any businesses would be open. The suspect also accused Gonzalez of ripping a container of orange juice out of his hand and throwing it into the trash, and refusing to let him use the remote control for their AC unit. He also claimed that Gonzalez threatened him with a knife. Unable to control his pent-up rage, Pages allegedly grabbed his gun and shot at his mother. He said he tried to turn the gun on himself but had no more bullets. Authorities later charged him with second-degree murder. The man reportedly had no prior history with law enforcement before the shooting. According to jail records, he's now being held without bond while his case is pending. Number 5. John Mark Barber. In a bizarre dispute that a judge later described as petty, a fight among residents at an apartment complex in Boulder, Colorado, over feeding squirrels led to gunfire. It all started when neighbors noticed 59-year-old John Mark Barber leaving pounds of peanuts outside on a regular basis. Parents expressed concerns over some children with peanut allergies who lived at the property and found Barber's hobby to be messy. In response to the complaints, Barber created flyers explaining that feeding the squirrels is his way of connecting with his dead parents. He got mad when he saw a neighbor, Jeffrey Browning, taking down the flyers. As a result, there was a confrontation, and Barber shot Browning in the butt from behind. He then called 911 and admitted to the shooting. Authorities charged Barber with attempted murder and first-degree assault. In court, he claimed he shot the man in self-defense, but the jury didn't buy it, and he was convicted of both charges. At his sentencing hearing, Deputy District Attorney Lisa Sacamano expressed a deep concern over Barber's lack of remorse and refusal to take responsibility for his actions. She also found it troubling that Barber didn't think he needed any sort of mental health treatment and was concerned he would pose a danger to the public in the future. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison. According to state prison records, Barber's next parole hearing will be in 2024, and he'll be released in 2027 at the latest. Number 4. Eric Aguirre. 29-year-old Eric Aguirre met up with a date at a restaurant in Houston, Texas, during early 2023 and was told that he had to pay a $20 parking fee. The attendant at the lot said that as long as he came back outside with a receipt proving that he ate at the restaurant, he'd eventually get his money back. So Aguirre went to a nearby ATM for cash and paid $40 for himself and his date to park their two vehicles. They were about to sit down for dinner when an employee came up to Aguirre and told him that the person in the parking lot who had charged him to park was actually a scammer. Aguirre told his date he'd be right back after hearing this and went outside the restaurant. When he came back a few minutes later, he told his date that everything was fine and that he had simply scared the scammer away. But Aguirre seemed on edge, and he decided at the last minute that he and his date should eat dinner somewhere else. The woman was shocked to find out the next day that the fake parking lot attendant, Elliot Nix, had been fatally shot from behind while Aguirre went outside. Police had posted surveillance photographs of her and Aguirre online in hopes of receiving help identifying them. Wanting to make it crystal clear that she had no involvement whatsoever in the murder, the woman called the police herself and shared everything that she knew. Witnesses reported seeing Aguirre grabbing his gun from his car and chasing after the victim. They heard a gunshot, then saw Aguirre calmly walking back to his car, where he put his gun back and went back inside the restaurant. He was later charged with murder and could possibly face life in prison if convicted. Number 3. Trevor Gibbon. 45-year-old Allison Morrison was ambushed by her neighbor, 48-year-old Trevor Gibbon, while walking to work in London in 2015. Gibbon approached the woman with 2 knives and stabbed her in what seems to be a well-thought-out attack. Morrison clung to life just long enough to help identify her attacker. The murder came one morning after Morrison was granted an order of protection against Gibbon, marking what she hoped was the end of a petty rivalry that her obsessed neighbor couldn't let go of. The man also pleaded guilty to harassment the day before Morrison's death. The feud started after Morrison moved into the building with her husband and son in 2011. Gibbon and his partner, Maria Perret, began complaining immediately about Morrison's son supposedly making strange noises. Fearing for her family's safety, Morrison installed a security camera in her house. It wasn't long before she felt like she was being watched. Police tried to mediate between the two parties in hopes of helping them come to an understanding, but Gibbon and Perrette were unwilling to even try negotiating. According to complaints filed by Morrison, Gibbon banged pots and pans together during the morning, flashed his car lights towards her home, blocked her car in their shared driveway, and did more. On one occasion, he pulled his car up next to Morrison and her husband, who were also in their vehicle, and simply stared at them before driving away. Gibbon also allegedly followed Morrison's husband to his workplace. After being convicted of harassment and served with an order of protection, he reportedly threw a tantrum inside the courtroom. As the day wore on, his anger became unbearable. Gibbon fled the murder scene in his car. When police tracked him down, he stomped his feet and threw another fit about how he hadn't done anything wrong. In court, he tried to blame his actions on mental illness and claimed he had zero memory of the attack. He probably cried more when the jury refused to buy his lies and convicted him of murder. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Number 2. Mima Mameni. Cash App founder Bob Lee was discovered stabbed to death in San Francisco during April 2023. Through surveillance footage, authorities traced the murder to a 38-year-old IT consultant named Mima Mameni. They apprehended him after a 9-day manhunt and officially charged him with the murder. According to court documents, Lee was in town visiting from Miami. The day before the crime, he drank at a friend's apartment with some people, including Mameni's sister, Kazar Eliasnia. He eventually went back to his hotel room with a friend who overheard Lee talking on the phone with Mameni. The witness said that Mameni asked Lee if his sister had used drugs or done anything inappropriate during the night. Lee reassured him that nothing inappropriate happened. Eliasria is married to a prominent plastic surgeon. The nature of her relationship with Lee and whether her marriage was struggling at the time are unclear, but some speculate that the two had a romantic fling. The friend left shortly after midnight and Lee went to Eliasnia's home. Charging documents state that Lee and Mameni left together 80 minutes later in Mameni's car. The vehicle went in the opposite direction of the victim's hotel. Surveillance footage reportedly showed two individuals, believed to be Mameni and Lee, walking to a dark and secluded area. In the video, one of the people could be seen lunging toward the other with an object and then quickly leaving the scene while the other seemed injured. Lee clung to life long enough to call 911 and report the stabbing. By the time an officer got there, he was unresponsive and bleeding uncontrollably. He was rushed to the hospital where he died on the operating table with a stab wound to the heart. While searching through his phone, detectives found a text from Eliasnia expressing concern for Lee's well-being and acknowledging that her brother came way down hard on you during their talk the night before. She thanked Lee for handling the situation with class. A toxicology report showed that Lee had alcohol, cocaine, and ketamine in his system when he was killed. Mameni's defense attorney, Paula Canny, suggested that drug use may have played a role in whatever sort of altercation happened before Lee's death. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that someone using drugs doesn't automatically give others a license to kill them. District Attorney Brooke Jenkins told the press that it's a common strategy for defense attorneys to shift blame to the victim. The case is still in its early stages and will probably take quite some time to work its way through the court system, so we'll have to be patient as it progresses. Number 1. Thomas Gilbert Jr. One afternoon in 2015, Thomas Gilbert Jr. showed up at his parents' Midtown Manhattan apartment. It was his first time seeing them in months. Thomas wanted to talk with his dad, Thomas Sr., alone and asked his mom, Shelley, to buy him a soda and some lunch. She offered to cook, but he insisted on her picking up food. Simply happy to see her son and hoping he'd work out his differences with his dad, Shelley left. But she was immediately overcome with a strange sense of dread. Things had been rocky between Thomas and his father, and while Shelley initially thought her son had come over to make peace, something seemed off. She was gone for no longer than a few minutes when she came home and found Thomas Sr. on the floor with a gunshot wound in his head. Thomas Jr. had already left the apartment by that point. The shooter left the gun in his father's hand in an attempt to make it look as though he had taken his own life. But Shelley already knew what had actually happened, and she told the 911 dispatcher she spoke with that her son shot her husband, stating that Thomas was nuts, but I didn't know he was this nuts. Thomas Gilbert Sr. was a successful hedge fund manager who had given his son an incredibly privileged life, which included a prestigious and paid-for education at Princeton University. But Thomas Jr. failed to hold steady employment after graduating college with an economics degree. His father hoped he would go into finance and take over the family business, but he only worked with him for a short period. Yet he stayed on the payroll, and he continued to live off his parents' achievements well into his adulthood. Thomas Jr. relied on his mother and father to pay his $2,400 rent, his vehicle payments, travel expenses, and exclusive gym and country club memberships on top of the $1,000 per week allowance they gave him. He also often hit his parents up for extra cash on top of his allowance, sometimes receiving as much as $10,000 per month from them. To put it plainly, the man was a leech. The Gilberts eventually got tired of supporting their adult son and saw no reason why he couldn't work and pay his own bills. In the months leading up to Thomas Sr.'s murder, he gradually reduced Thomas Jr.'s weekly allowance to $300, stopped paying his rent, and told his son that he needed to get his life together. After the murder, Thomas Jr. spent the next 4 years wasting away at Rikers Island Jail as his attorneys and the prosecutor argued over whether he was competent enough to stand trial. Prosecutors accused him of having an overinflated sense of entitlement and murdering his father in cold blood when Thomas Sr. told him that he had to be an adult. With supporting testimony from multiple experts, the killer's attorney argued that his client suffers from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder and paranoid schizophrenia, and that he didn't recognize that his actions were morally wrong at the time of the shooting. The court ultimately ruled that Thomas was competent and could stand trial. During the proceedings, the court heard about the defendant's history of responding to petty disputes with violence. A former roommate claimed that Gilbert punched him in the face for allegedly mistreating his dog. Not long after that, the roommate's family's home in the Hamptons mysteriously burned to the ground somehow. No one was ever charged for the arson, but the roommate firmly believes that Gilbert had something to do with it. In deciding their verdict, the jury was asked to consider whether they thought the defendant was aware of the wrongfulness of his actions. Nobody disagreed that Thomas was severely mentally ill, but based on the fact that he sent his mom out to buy a sandwich and a Coke, something that he knew his parents wouldn't have lying around in their apartment, the jury decided that his actions were too deliberate for him to be unaware that what he was doing wasn't wrong. Thomas was convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, despite his mother's pleas for the judge to institutionalize him instead. And while some have argued that he fell through the cracks of a legal system that punishes mental illness, many believe that he's exactly where he should be. Thanks for watching. Which of these stories surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below.